Hello everyone. Today, I continue to bring you the next part of the story centered around Officer Lytudiep and the shocking case involving CEO James. In the previous episode, the audience witnessed an incident that unfolded far too suddenly. James, the head of a major corporation, was unexpectedly summoned and temporarily detained by authorities for investigation. The reason given was that his company was suspected of falsifying accounting records and showing signs of long-term tax evasion. The news spread rapidly, not only causing turmoil within the company but also leaving those closest to James completely unprepared for the emotional impact. Diep was the one who suffered the greatest shock. Everything happened too quickly, too overwhelmingly, leaving her barely able to stand her ground. In such a short period of time, her life, once seemingly stable, was thrown into chaos. She found herself facing probing looks, endless whispers, and above all, an overwhelming and undefined fear for James's future. In her state of extreme confusion, Diep no longer knew what to believe, nor whom she could turn to for support. In the end, she went to Lytudiep. It was not a decision made after careful consideration, but rather the final instinct of someone standing on the brink of collapse. In front of them, Diep could no longer maintain her usual composure. Her broken sentences, panicked eyes, and undisguised helplessness revealed just how devastating the psychological blow truly was. Lee, in his role as a police officer, maintained the necessary calm. He listened to Diep without interrupting, without rushing to draw conclusions. Only after she had gradually regained some composure did Lee begin to speak. His voice was not loud, nor did it carry an imposing certainty, but it was steady enough for Diep to cling to as a source of reassurance. Lee affirmed that the case would be investigated thoroughly and that everything must be based on evidence and truth. If James was truly innocent, he would not allow anyone to be wrongfully accused. Lytudiep stood quietly beside them, saying little, yet her presence alone gave Diep a sense of shared burden. The empathy in her eyes, her attentive posture, and the serious demeanor of both officers made Diep realize that, at least for this moment, she was not alone. And from that point on, the investigation officially entered a far more critical phase, a decisive one. As soon as Lee began re-examining the company's financial records, he devoted an extraordinary amount of time to scrutinizing even the smallest details. On the surface, the financial reports appeared well organized. The numbers were logically arranged, timelines were clear, and tax filings had been submitted on schedule. At a glance, it would have been easy to believe that everything was in order. But with years of experience in the field, Lee did not stop at appearances. He began cross-referencing the data, comparing internal reports with related documentation. It was here that the irregularities slowly began to surface. Some discrepancies were minor, almost negligible on their own, yet when placed side by side, they failed to align perfectly. Certain revenues were fully recorded on paper, but when Lee traced the actual cash flow, there were no corresponding transactions to be found. The tax reports themselves were submitted on time, flawless in form. However, the company's bank accounts revealed a different story. Funds had been withdrawn steadily over a long period of time. Individually, these withdrawals did not raise alarms, but when accumulated and analyzed cyclically, they formed an abnormal pattern that Lee could not ignore. The deeper Lee delved into the files, the more pronounced the contradictions became. The data, which initially appeared complete and coherent, began to crumble under close examination. Everything seemed designed to pass routine inspections, yet not sophisticated enough to withstand a comprehensive investigation. From these findings, a tentative assessment began to take shape in Lee's mind. James might be the legal representative, the one bearing ultimate responsibility on paper, but what Lee was seeing suggested that James was not the person directly manipulating the numbers. The way the data had been adjusted, the timing of the cash flow interference, and the repetitive nature of the transactions all pointed to someone with deep, hands-on knowledge of the accounting system, rather than a CEO focused primarily on overall management. This assessment could not yet be called a conclusion, but it was enough for Lee to understand that the case was far more complex than it initially appeared. And behind those cold, lifeless numbers, there were still many truths waiting to be uncovered. The investigation continued, step by step, under absolute caution. Based on all the evidence collected during the earlier stages of the investigation, Lee and the task force began entering the phase of narrowing down potential suspects. This was a critical stage, one that required absolute clarity of mind and the ability to analyze even the smallest details with precision. Every position within James's company was re-examined once again, every role, every level of authority was placed under careful scrutiny. During this process, one name gradually became impossible to ignore: the company's chief accountant. This individual was responsible for the entire accounting system, directly managing financial records and controlling the inflow and outflow of funds over many consecutive years. As Lee and his team conducted a more thorough review, they discovered that nearly all irregularities within the records were directly linked to this position. The manner in which figures were adjusted, the way reports were altered while still maintaining a lawful appearance, and the precise timing of cash flow manipulation all pointed to someone with deep, intimate knowledge of the internal accounting system. According to verified documents and evidence, this individual was the one who directly falsified the books, manipulated financial reports, and gradually embezzled tax funds as well as company assets over many years. These illegal actions did not occur overnight, nor did they involve large sums that would immediately draw attention. Instead, the process was carried out quietly, broken down into smaller amounts, repeated cyclically to evade detection during routine inspections. It was precisely this level of sophistication that allowed the misconduct to persist for so long without being exposed. On paper, the company continued to operate normally. Reports were submitted on time, and no major errors appeared to exist. However, once Lee peeled back each layer, the facade began to crumble, revealing a carefully concealed system of fraud beneath. When signs of exposure began to surface and authorities officially intervened, the suspect reacted swiftly. There was no hesitation, no visible uncertainty. He immediately sought to flee. His departure from the area was executed with striking speed, suggesting premeditation. Within a short period of time, he had crossed the border into Cambodia, evading pursuit while arrest warrants were still in the process of being finalized. This act of flight further reinforced the task force's assessment. What had once been suspicion now became a clear behavioral response from someone fully aware of his own crimes. Fleeing at such a sensitive moment demonstrated that the suspect understood that once apprehended, years of concealed fraud would inevitably come to light. However, the pursuit was far from simple. Further intelligence revealed that the suspect had not only crossed into Cambodia but had also gone into hiding within autonomous regions. These areas, known for their complex terrain and fragmented administrative oversight, posed significant challenges for tracking and apprehension. A single misstep could cause all traces to vanish instantly, forcing the entire operation to start over from scratch. Lee and his team were compelled to coordinate with multiple agencies. Every fragment of information was collected, no matter how vague. At this stage, the investigation no longer followed regular working hours but continued relentlessly under extreme pressure. There were days when the task force uncovered no new leads at all. Information that initially seemed promising suddenly led to dead ends. At certain points, all trails appeared to disappear entirely. The suspect's movements became unclear, communication channels were severed, and the intelligence gathered was insufficient to pinpoint an exact location. The prolonged silence weighed heavily on the team. The pressure stemmed not only from the workload, but also from the awareness that each passing day left James bearing the stigma of investigation, with the truth still unrevealed. Lee understood this all too well. He knew that even a single delay would further tarnish James's name in the eyes of the public. This was not merely about one individual's reputation, it affected everyone connected to the case, especially Diep, who continued to wait day after day in a state of prolonged anxiety and uncertainty. For that reason, Lee refused to give up. No matter how fragile the leads appeared, he ordered the team to re-examine all previously collected data. Every timeline, every location, every minor connection was reanalyzed from the beginning. Information once deemed insignificant was pieced together again, little by little, forming a clearer picture. After many consecutive days of tension, those efforts finally yielded results. A crucial source emerged, identifying the area where the suspect was hiding near the Cambodian border. Immediately, an arrest plan was set in motion through close coordination among the involved forces. Every step was carefully calculated, leaving the suspect no further opportunity to escape. And after a long period on the run, the suspect was finally apprehended in the border region of Cambodia. The seemingly endless escape came to an end, closing a chapter of life spent in evasion and concealment. The intense manhunt that had stretched over many days reached a critical turning point, laying the groundwork for what was to come, as the truth moved ever closer to the light. When the true mastermind was escorted back to the country, the long chain of events that had stretched over many days finally shifted into a different state. The overlapping suspicions faded. The blurred uncertainties no longer lingered. Each link in the case was placed back into its proper position, and the full truth gradually emerged, clear, coherent, leaving no room for speculation or misunderstanding. Statements, documents, and evidence were reviewed once again. The financial reports that had once placed James under suspicion now became the very proof that cleared his name. Every trace pointed to the same conclusion: James had no knowledge of the falsified accounting records, nor of the systematic tax evasion carried out by his subordinate. He was the legal representative, the one who bore responsibility in name, but he was not the person who manipulated or directed those unlawful actions. When that truth was officially confirmed, it did not arrive with noise or spectacle. There were no dramatic announcements, no public displays. Yet it carried enough weight to erase every doubt that had surrounded James. The days spent under investigative pressure, every action scrutinized, every decision questioned, finally came to an end. James was formally exonerated. His reputation and integrity were restored, not through emotional defense, but through the clear affirmation of law and evidence. For James, that moment was far more than a procedural conclusion. It was release, after a long period of living under extreme tension. It was the feeling of finally being able to lift his head, not to justify himself, not to explain, but simply to stand in the truth. And yet, alongside that relief were lingering aftershocks. What he had endured left behind a different kind of silence within him, deeper, more restrained, more cautious than before. For Diep, the moment James was cleared became a milestone she knew she would never forget. Throughout the course of the case, she had lived in a constant state of imbalance, with nothing solid to hold on to. The days spent waiting for news felt endless, heavy beyond measure. Every vibration of her phone, every mention of the word investigation, tightened her chest with fear. Diep passed through every possible emotional state: confusion, helplessness, self-blame, and the terrifying fear of losing everything in a moment she could not control. When the truth was finally brought to light, all the suppressed emotions at last found an outlet. Not through loud sobbing or dramatic reactions, but through a profound emptiness, the kind that follows when a long-standing fear finally dissolves. A relief so deep it bordered on exhaustion. After everything was officially resolved, James and Diep decided to go to Lee and to Sam's home to express their gratitude in person. The visit was not elaborately prepared. There were no formal arrangements, no polite social rituals. James did not come as a CEO, nor as a representative of a corporation or social status. He came as someone who had stood at the edge of an abyss, who had faced the possibility of losing his reputation, his career, and the trust he had built. In the modest space of the house, James thanked Lee with absolute sincerity. He expressed his gratitude for Lee's refusal to rush to judgment when the truth was still unclear. For not allowing pressure, personal emotion, or preconceived bias to influence the investigation. Most of all, for Lee's persistence in pursuing the truth to the very end, even when the path was difficult, even when it led repeatedly into dead ends. Diep stood beside James, quiet yet unmistakably present. She did not need to say much. Her gaze and demeanor spoke for her. It was the gratitude of someone who had once been overwhelmed by despair, who had feared that justice might arrive too late, yet ultimately witnessed the truth being restored to where it belonged. In response to those words of thanks, Lee showed no pride, no sense of personal achievement. He simply shook his head gently. The gesture was not a refusal, but a calm affirmation of his role. His voice was steady, unraised, unembellished. He said it was his responsibility to determine right from wrong, to protect the innocent. This was what a police officer was meant to do, regardless of whether anyone expressed gratitude. No grand promises were spoken. No symbolic declarations were made. Just a brief sentence, yet it was enough for James and Diep to understand that justice does not always arrive amid applause or bright lights. Sometimes, justice is built through patience, through refusing to give up, and through the professional conscience of those who quietly do their duty, despite all pressure. The meeting ended in a gentle silence. The atmosphere was neither heavy nor overly emotional. Yet its resonance lingered for a long time afterward. It was the echo of a case brought into the light, of trust preserved, and of a moment in which everyone present understood that some truths do not need to be spoken loudly to remain deeply engraved in the human heart. The case has come to a close, yet the echoes it leaves behind remain, quietly existing in the lives of everyone involved. When all investigative procedures are completed, when the truth has been fully revealed and justice formally affirmed in writing, what lingers is no longer files or evidence, but the subtle shifts taking place within the human heart. The turbulent days have passed, but their marks cannot disappear overnight. For James, the period of suspicion, of standing at the fragile boundary between right and wrong, has left him with more reflections than ever before. When his reputation is restored, when his innocence is proven, the question is no longer whether he is guilty or not, but how he will move forward after having crossed such a narrow line. After standing so close to losing everything, how will James change in the way he views people, his work, and the relationships surrounding him? For Diep, the recent storm was not merely a trial of circumstance, but a test of faith. She endured long days filled with anxiety, fear, and uncertainty, when the future seemed completely out of reach. Now that everything has settled, now that the truth has been returned to its rightful place, how will Diep look at life? Will these experiences make her stronger, or more cautious when facing the uncertainties ahead? And for Lee and to Sam, the closing of this case does not mean the road ahead becomes smooth. For those in their profession, each resolved case is only a milestone, never a destination. After relentless efforts, after days of tension and pressure, will new challenges continue to await them? Other cases, other decisions, and new boundaries between right and wrong still quietly exist, waiting to be confronted with integrity and professional responsibility. Everything seems to have returned to a state of calm, but it is not an empty calm. It holds unanswered questions, silent transformations, and crossroads that each character will have to face in the journey ahead. Stay tuned for the next episode. To continue following the story of Lee, to Sam, James, and Diep.
Hello mọi người, chào mừng mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình và cảm ơn mọi người đã lắng nghe hết câu chuyện ngày hôm nay mình chia sẻ. Hy vọng rằng mọi người sẽ yêu thích những câu chuyện của mình và ủng hộ kênh cho mình để mình có động lực ra nhiều video hơn cho mọi người cùng xem. Hiện tại thì kênh của mình đang kể về câu chuyện của những người mẹ đơn thân sinh sống ở Việt Nam. Và nếu mà mọi người yêu thích những câu chuyện này thì nhớ bật chuông thông báo và bấm nút theo dõi để nhận thông báo khi mà mình đăng video mới nhất, để những video mới thì sẽ không bị mọi người bỏ sót. Và nhớ theo dõi để ủng hộ kênh giúp cho mình để mình có động lực ra nhiều video hơn. Và cảm ơn mọi người đã lắng nghe một phút chia sẻ của mình. Hy vọng rằng sẽ được đồng hành cùng mọi người trong thời gian sắp tới. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở trong những video tiếp theo của mình nhé.